Well, good afternoon and welcome to our conversation. Today we want to discuss the Giving USA report and some other transactions that we've been observing in the charitable giving space and also in what we'll call the benevolence space. I'm here with my colleague, Jason Blumenthal, and we want to thank you for your time, and let's dive right into the subject matter. We're going to have a quick conversation about what Giving USA has reported, and we're pleased to be a member of the Institute and a donor to the foundation. Talk a bit about the growth in crowdfunding and the impact of charitable or social investing, social impact investing on charity, the growth therein, and then some recent changes that we've seen in corporate structure that have hit the headlines. And then at the end, talk about what, in our view, is a mix of benevolence and charity and our recommendations. So let's get started with the Giving USA 2022 report, or the 2023 report reporting on activity in 2022. The big news is that giving decreased by 3.5% in current dollars and decreased by 10.5% when you adjust for inflation. And as you know, giving hit some all-time peaks in 2020 and 2021, in part driven by the human response to the agonies experienced by COVID and the social unrest that was tempered by the George Floyd murder. In 2022, contributions were almost $500 billion, 499.33. Again, the majority of that coming from individuals, 43% from those living, 9% from those who passed away and left money in their bequests. So in total, individuals represent 73% of all the tax recorded charitable gifts, 21% from foundations, and corporations, again, because of their drive to provide return on equity to shareholders, only give about 6% of the total. That hasn't changed much over time. What has changed are the organizations that are receiving the money. For the longest period of time, religion, always the largest slice of the pie, represented almost half of the total. In the last few years, that's dropped down below 20% or 30%. In the last year, it hit 27%. Human services, again, because of the interest of addressing actual human need and suffering in the last few years, has moved into second place. Traditionally, there was an argument between education and healthcare who would shift back and forth in second and third position. But what we see now is human services in a strong second, education in a third place with 13% of the total. And what's fascinating is gifts to grant-making foundations. This, my friends, would equate to donations from individuals to, in essence, family foundations or corporations to corporate foundations. And then 10% of total to health, 9% public society benefit, international affairs at 6%. And that actually grew a little bit in this past year because of the interest in the war in Ukraine. This chart identifies the change year over year in terms of inflation-adjusted dollars. The gold bars represent the change between 2021, and for the most part, you see growth with the exception of bequests. And the blue represents the change between 2021 and 2022. And again, across the board, all the sources were down year over year. Changes by type of recipient, for the most part, decreased, except gifts to foundations and international affairs, again, driven by the interest in supporting those suffering in the Ukraine. Now, what's fascinating to note is that in the last 10 years, there have been 400,000 new nonprofits that have been created. So in addition to what we saw in terms of growth in giving in the last couple of years, 20 and 21, and we see a decline in 2022, we're also seeing an increase in competition amongst traditional 501c3 charitable organizations. And that's important to note because what Giving USA has been recording are donations to things that trigger a taxable event or occurrence, or more specifically, the ability to deduct a donation on your tax return. So what I want to do is transition my colleague Jason to talk about the growth in crowdfunding and peer-to-peer models, because these aren't always tax deductible and yet still a sign of benevolence. Jason?
Great. Thanks, Scott. So crowdfunding has existed forever. In the Muslim community, you have their zakat, and the Jewish culture, you have the moshav, and that's community. What's changed over the last few years is it's really, really exploded, primarily due to the internet and easy access. So when you look at it, Blackbaud did this lovely report where online giving has a 9% year-on-year growth, which is pretty significant compared to other things that are not growing. The thing that's most troubling is that you have a very small retention of these people. Less than 50% of the people that make an online gift to a 501c3 are retained. There is very little stewardship, and we can do a whole separate webinar discussion about that. All right. So when we talk about organizations like GoFundMe, Kickstarter, Meta's, which is Facebook and Instagram, they sometimes are 501c3, sometimes they're not, and more often than not, they're not. Right? It's the dear friends you might have heard about, our coach and great neighbor who was in a horrible car accident. And they'll raise thousands to tens of thousands to millions of dollars. That's not a tax deductible event because it's going from an individual to an individual. You also have businesses that want to start up. You have artists that want to start up. Caring Bridge in particular is a very interesting model because they're a 501c3, so you can donate to them, but on almost every single page, they have a donate now button. And that doesn't go to Caring Bridge. That goes to the individual who has set it up through a GoFundMe or through PayPal or some other direct deposit thing. So it isn't tracked by any of these organizations that track charitable giving. Okay. Eva, another example where that's technically a loan. Somebody wants to start up a business, and these are micro loans, $50 to $5,000 are the biggest ones. A lot of people do $5. Technically, it's a loan. It's a business transaction. But it's quite possible that many of the people are doing it are thinking of it from the same pocket that they're giving charity. Here's somebody in Uganda that wants to start up a business to help their family. I like what they're doing. I've got the money. I'm going to invest in it. When we look at the numbers, it's really exploded. 1.7 for GoFundMe. That's how much they brought in. By 2030, the estimate is $27.5 billion. And most of that is not 501c3. When you look at all the crowdfunding, it could very easily hit $400 billion by 2030. And that, again, that's the Kickstarter, the GoFundMes, the Instagram and Facebook and Meta didn't even have this 5 years ago. They brought in about $2 billion in the last 2 years, and it's direct funding. So if we look at it, this is what we're talking about. Huge, huge numbers. It is possible that some of these numbers are coming from what was going to charity. It's likely that some of it is happening. Scott, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so the question this frames is, can both things be true simultaneously? How, on the one hand, can we have a decline in giving and donors that we saw from the Giving USA report, and it's rather impactful because historically, giving in the U.S. by individuals has represented 2% of gross domestic product. So when there was a recession, oftentimes giving either stalled or grew only slightly because those that had took care of those that did not, with the exception of 2008, 2009, when everybody lost a third of all their assets and giving went down as the economy went down. And it took several years for that to return. This past year, we saw a growth in the economy, and yet we saw a decline in individual giving as a percentage of GDP, down to 1.7, not the traditional 2%. So if we've got a decline going on in one hand, and yet we've got an increase in crowdfunding and social impact investing, is it possible that there's a blurring in the mind between what might be charity, which is something that the IRS would recognize as a gift to a 501c3 organization, and other signs of doing social good? So, Jason, you want to talk some more?
Yeah, so it's more than just the crowdfunding. There's many other opportunities. One of them is impact investing. It's exploded. It's been around for 30, 40, 50 years, but it's really exploded. Just a few examples. In Minneapolis, there's an organization called Brown Venture Group. They're a for-profit VC firm, but their impact in that they invest in BIPOC-owned startups only. Recently, they received investments from Huntington National Bank, $3 million, and $1.5 million from the Bush Foundation. Bush Foundation is Archie Bush, who's one of the founders of this little company called 3M. This investment came from the Bush Foundation. This is where they typically give to charities. They give to 501c3s, and this went to a for-profit corporation because in their mind, it's an impact investment. Same thing with Huntington National Bank. The question will be, is this in lieu of money that they would have given to give to charities, or is it an increase? Time will tell. Another example that we're seeing more and more of is you've probably heard of Mark Zuckerberg, Meta, Facebook. So he took his wealth, his stock, and did not start up a family foundation, did not give it into the Silicon Valley. He's putting it all into an LLC, a for-profit LLC. He is using more of the Stephen Jobs model, which is creating good jobs. He will invest similar, he says he will invest similar to Brown. He will do socially conscientious. He will do this, he will do that. But that $98 billion value as of a few weeks ago will not show up in any reports as charitable giving. If you look at impact investments, there was, we use the term funds under management. It's, a term that brokers use. There was 163 billion, according to most reports, in 2017. Last year, there was 1.16 trillion, and by 2024, there'll be close to $2 trillion in impact investment funds. It's become such a big deal and the lines are being so blurred that the organization that helps Mackenzie Scott and multiple other billionaires figure out who to give their charitable money to now has an impact investment division. So you can call them and say, I like animals, who should I give to? They'll talk about Humane Society and a dozen organizations, and then they will say, or we can look at this Fidelity Fund that only invests in makeup companies that don't harm animals, or that. So it's actually part of the whole portfolio. So, I mean, if you think about it, if 1% of that $1.9 trillion is pulled from money that was charitable, right? That's 1.9, that's what, $10 trillion? It's a huge deal.
So, I mean, Jason, if you look at just this last year, the 1.16 trillion that was in investment funds, if 1% of that came to the table, you're adding enough money that we would have actually surpassed the 2021 dollars. We would have been close to 600 billion at 599 billion instead of where we are at 499. It's significant money.
It's significant money, and I can only speak anecdotally, but I've spoken to two extreme high net worth people that have taken and put money into impact investing funds with the idea that they'll use those returns and assign the returns to charitable giving. So instead of taking this $1 million that I was going to give to a charity, I'm putting it in an impact investment fund, and I'll take the hopefully 7 to 15% return and give that to charities. And in their mind, over time, it does much more good because they'll give more than $1 million, and through that $1 million investment, they're also doing good. That's the way they're thinking it through.
And there's actually, in some cases, tax advantages to this.
Yes, significant. The federal government has started a program which you've probably seen emails, webinars for, called Opportunity Zones. It is a tax, the derogatory term would be a tax shelter, if you will. We don't need to read through the whole thing, but basically it says you invest in putting a business or buying a building, or in many cases, there's a version of an REIT, a real estate fund. You can take your money and put it into an opportunity zone fund. Every community has designated opportunity zones where they want you to build. And if you invest in those properties, you're not taxed the same way. It's a huge financial deferment. And again, anecdotal things, but we've had extreme high net worth people where they cash out on a building and their accountant says to them, you know, you can do this 1031B, or you take the money and dump it into an opportunity zone, and it's going to wipe out most of the gains you would have to pay, and you can refinance, and you're doing good for the community. So it happens. You have examples down where you live, Scott.
Yeah, right here in Collier County, we've got 3 census tracts that are identified as opportunity zones. And Jason and I are actually working with a couple of philanthropies on one side and philanthropic investors on the other, with the potential of actually acquiring property that would create affordable housing or emergency overnight shelters for people who are experiencing homelessness, or office space for nonprofits. There are even tax credits for business incubators, you know, that would help create jobs in these areas. So, you know, in every single place in the country, and Naples, Collier County is fairly high end from a 30,000-foot perspective, yet there is significant homelessness here, and there's significant shortage of affordable housing for many. And these present opportunities for people to do both good and get some tax benefit from it.
It can be a win-win-win. We just had a case in Minneapolis where a businessman opened up a manufacturing facility in an opportunity zone. He's going to put in hopefully at least 100 high-paying jobs over $50 an hour. He signed a deal with a local not-for-profit that's going to train these people. So it's a win-win-win. Yet the expense of him buying the land, building the building, putting in all this equipment, none of that shows up as a charitable gift. But it's the definition of benevolence in many ways. He could have done this. He didn't have to do it there. He could have done it somewhere where the jobs were already there and there was less risk. But that's benevolence. Another example of things that are happening that make it harder or different to track or blur this, if you want, is the way businesses are being transferred, being sold generational to generational. A big example is Patagonia, which you may have heard about. The family, instead of selling it, instead of doing an ESOP, created a 501c4 and transferred 98% of the stock, $3 billion value, to a 501c4. None of that shows up in the Giving USA report, that $3 billion. Did a 501c4 versus a 501c3 because a 501c4 basically can be as political as they want. But it's not a tax deductible gift, so it wouldn't show up in any of these reports.
But what they want to do is promote the environment. And this is a way for them to advocate for that as well as maintain the ownership of the company.
Yep, the family retains ownership. Now, in this particular model, the 2% that didn't go into the 501c4 has 100% of the voting rights of the business operations of Patagonia. So there's this new 501c4 foundation that gets the profits and gets this $3 billion worth of stock, but they don't actually manage the company. And they have no real management or ownership of it.
But basically what we're looking at here from our perspective is the concept of people doing good. And some of that doing good is predicated on something that the IRS would view as a taxable event. They put money in a donor advised fund. They put money in a family foundation. They make a gift to a particular charity and are able to itemize that on their tax return, and it gets recorded. And again, as we noted earlier, there's been this historic equation of growth in the economy. Every time the economy grows, giving grows, and giving is represented 2% of GDP for the better part of 2 decades. This year, it did not. So our sense is that while that occurred, it's also true, as Jason pointed out, that actual assistance to other individuals increased via GoFundMe. Actual assistance to social entrepreneurialism increased through impact investing, through some of these other corporate transfers. And so while there's been a decline in traditional charitable giving that we see here as a percentage of personal income, and what the Fundraising Effectiveness Project pointed out, which is an organization on which we also serve on the board of directors, in the last year, the number of donors went down, dollars went down, and retention went down. Jason pointed out the 50% retention in online giving. Overall, we're seeing a decline in retention across the board at the charitable organizations that we're tracking in the fundraising effectiveness database. Now, there was a spike in 2020 in giving, but overall, if you look at the last 10 years, you can see in the orange bar, the number of donors has declined. And that's not just true here in the US. This is being seen in Canada, it's being seen in the UK, it's also seen in Australia. So we've got, as our friend Nathan Chappelle points out, a generosity crisis, but maybe that crisis is only in terms of traditional charitable giving, and that benevolence is being distributed a bit more across the board. So from our vantage point, looking from the peak of the mountain across the valley and maybe peering through the haze, we've got a couple of recommendations. And number one is to reinforce this point that donors and investors are beginning to blur the lines between charity and benevolence. And then, Jason, what's the importance of stewardship?
Yeah, so Jerry Panis used to say, right, thank your donors, then thank them 3 more times, basically in paraphrasing. They have a million options. You need to thank them. You need to pay attention to them. You need to make them think they're the most important person in the world, because they are. Because without them, your organizations don't exist. You cannot rely on the $1 million gifts. You can't focus on just the $5 gifts. You have to remember to thank everyone.
And you've got to invest in stewardship and engagement strategies,
Yeah.
and novel ways of stewardship. Maybe when someone makes a first-time gift, you have an onboarding package and you give them information about the organization.
If you're not going to thank them, somebody else will. And I can't tell you how many times we've heard stories of the sending the $10 a month online and nothing happening, and then us running through the list and saying, you realize that person's $1 million capacity. Oh my gosh, I never knew. Because there isn't this stewardship. There's just this assumption that we deserve their money and they're going to give their money and that's it. There are so many more opportunities for people to give, not just blurring the lines, but the hundreds of thousands of more 501c3s. You have to do stewardship. You have to.
Yeah, and it's important to recognize that the lifetime value of a donor is significant, even if it's at the $50 level. Yeah. Right. I mean, we don't have to only focus on the gifts in excess of $100,000. But one of the things we've seen over the course of the last several years doing feasibility studies, Jason, is the demand for metrics.
Yeah.
People want to know the outcomes. So if they're investing in organizations in which they believe and trust, they want to know that their money is doing good. Here in Florida, Melanie Sablehouse is working with the Women's Foundation, and the donors got interested when they learned that there were 70 homeless senior women in our community. And so their objective was to get them off the street. So part of the challenge is to report back to those women who've made commitments, financial commitments, how many women were actually housed and brought into shelters and got a permanent footing. So, are we down to 60? Are we down to 50? Are we down to 25 who are still homeless? What's the impact? It's huge. And what's the importance of online giving?
So it's growing. It's only going to keep growing. It's so easy. Whatever social network platform somebody's using, there's donate now buttons. And historically, people in our world would always say, yeah, but we don't want to use those because people are going to give the least amount of money they can get away with. They're not going away. 30% of all online giving was done using mobile devices last year. To me, that's a significant thing. People are using their phones, they're flipping through and they're going, oh yeah, okay, I'll give. Oh yeah, okay, I'll give. So it has to be a part of your program. It can't be the only, but it has to be built in. And it knowing that the GoFundMe's and the Kivas are there. And I think, Scott, one of the things you said with the metrics might be a part of why that's so people love it so much, is it's direct giving. That is a metric. I am taking my money and I am helping my neighbor. That it's tangible. I can see it, right? That the old thing of, showing one person versus showing a whole community. The one person is actually more impactful in many ways, and that's a metric. So it really needs to be a part of your plan. Don't rely on it, but it needs to be part of it going forward.
And we need to think outside the box, both in terms of the acquisition strategies, the renewal strategies, and the stewardship strategies, because competition is everywhere. I mean, if people were satisfied with the traditional established charities, they wouldn't have established another 400,000 in the last 10 years. Yeah. So somebody said there's a need and I've got to create a foundation in order to meet that need. And there's also an avenue for social investment, which, as Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs says, is equally important. If I can, get someone employed or help them start a business and they're able to hire others, that's a benefit to society, just as, a charitable act. And as you pointed out, I'm living down here in Naples, where a year ago we had this horrific hurricane. If I'm able to give $100 to someone whose roof was just blown off and who's sleeping in a trailer, that's charitable in my brain, right?
Yeah.
It's not, I'm not able to write it down on my tax return, but it's as impactful for the person receiving that $100.
We have a neighbor who didn't support one of the local communities organizations and said, I'm not doing it this year because I'm helping my nephew with college. And that's $10,000-$15,000 a year. It's the same thing. And there's more of that happening because it's easier to do. It's always happened, but there's more of it. It's easier, and that's competition for the. Go ahead.
No, we know from our days in higher education that when someone said, "I'd like this scholarship to go to Alicia," we'd have to say, "No, you can't. That's your niece." And that would not be a charitable gift. You can make a donation to the scholarship fund and let the committee select who it goes to. But the minute you tell us to whom it goes, it's no longer charitable.
Right. So now they just give. They help out, and we're just seeing so much of that. So it's really paying attention to your donors, looking. The last example I would give about that, United Way, Red Cross, they're wonderful, amazing organizations. Forever, they were the top. They're not anymore. They're not in the top 5. They're not in the top 10. It's not that what they're doing isn't great, but I think we need to look at why they're not in the top anymore, because of things like this. People are giving more direct, I think.
And we've got to make it personal. It's all about the stories, the testimonies, the impact that each gift has on, improving lives, saving lives, making the world a better place. So we want to thank you for your time. If you'd like to get in touch with us and talk some more, both about these subjects at the macro level but more importantly, how this might impact your own programming, feel free to reach out, jason@visionaryphilanthropy.com or scott@visionaryphilanthropy.com, and we'd be delighted to spend some time with you. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
And come visit with us next month. Take care.